welcome again, John Sundell.
All right, thank you. All right, hi everybody. Thanks for coming again. Sorry about the problems we had earlier with the projector. I think it was overheated from all my animations. So hopefully it will stand this time. So for those of you who I didn't meet earlier, my name is John. I work at Hyper, which is a Norwegian digital agency. And in my spare time, I also work a lot on Swift developer tools, many of which are open source, or all of them actually are open source on GitHub. So my topic today is Swift scripting, and more importantly, how we can use it in real-life practical situations to become more productive as Swift developers. So I'm going to do this talk from the beginning, like Junior said, because some people might not have been here. So in case you were here in the morning, it's going to be a little bit of repetition, but you can just imagine that I have one of those Men in Black flashes that flashes your memory, and you know, now your memory is clean, so it will be like the first time, all right? All right, so when you see this title of this talk and this initial slide, you might be asking yourself one of the following two questions. First of all, you might ask yourself, what is this scripting thing and why should I care about it? What can you use scripts for and how can they make me more productive or make my life easier? And secondly, even if you have been doing a lot of scripting before in other languages, you might be asking yourself, why would I use Swift for scripting? I mean, there are a lot of great languages out there already that does scripting. Why is Swift different and what can it bring to the table? So my goal for this talk here today is to kind of give my answer to these two questions, as well as give you some demos, some examples, and also show you some tools that will make this a lot simpler for you and hopefully enable you to build some of your own automation and tooling. So let's dive in and start looking at the first one. Why do scripting? Well, for me, scripting is really a way to automate a certain series of tasks. Tasks that, for example, can be very repetitive. You have to do them maybe once a day or once a week or maybe once every time you do a release. They come up often and you kind of keep repeating yourself. And we know as developers, we really don't like to repeat ourselves. We tend to create abstractions and frameworks to avoid having to type the same code over and over again. And scripting is a way to do this also, but for things that are more like workflows. Repetitive things also tend to be quite error-prone, because if you have to do things multiple times, if you just make a single little mistake in the middle, it might propagate throughout the process and make the thing, basically explode in your face, and that's not very fun. And finally, repetitive things tend to be boring. We don't like to do boring stuff. We want to do fun and interesting things that challenges us in different ways and try out new technologies. We don't want to spend our time doing the same boring thing over and over again. And these are examples where scripting can really, really make a difference. So let's take a look at a practical example that you might encounter multiple times throughout your career as a developer. And that example I want to show you is if you find yourself in the need to rename a lot of files. So as we work with other people in our team, for example, designers or product managers or other people with different skill sets, we might find ourselves getting some files that we need to use in our project, but they're not really matching what we're expecting. For example, we might get from our designer a series of PNG images that we're going to use in an animation, but those PNG images have, some form of naming convention that we don't really agree with. In this case, you might spot what I'm going after, which is that this sequence of image here, which starts from 1 and goes all the way to 100, which is really, a bit annoying for us as developers. We really don't tend to want to start things from 1. We really want to start counting from 0, which, maybe doesn't make a lot of sense for people who are not programmers, but for us, it's the most natural thing in the world. So when we see something like this, we might, be shocked and think, what is this? How can someone start a sequence at 1? How is it possible? And your first immediate reaction might be to run over the office to your designer and be angry and be like, why did you name this frame 1? It should be frame 0. I've told you 100 times. Well, don't do that. We should try to be nice to each other. So instead of having to do that or having to go through all of these files and rename them manually, then let's write a script for it. Let's actually just take a couple of minutes and write a script that does this for us. So here what I'm doing is that I'm starting by accessing all the files in the current folder. And then I'm using Swift's enumerated sequence to get access to both the current image that I'm operating on as well as its index. And that way I can iterate over all the images, and for each one I can simply rename it to match the index that I'm expecting in my code. And this is just a simple example of where we were spending just like 1 or 2 minutes writing this like 6-line of code script, and it could save us a lot of pain and a lot of work having to do all of that manually or having someone else have to do it. So this kind of shows you where scripting can be really, really powerful in our day-to-day lives. But why use Swift for scripting? It is a quite new language, and there's a long history of doing scripting with other languages, such as Ruby or Python or Bash scripting. Why take Swift, which is just a complicated applications language with so many different features, and bring it into scripting? Well, initially, you might be tempted to come up with an emotional argument, such as, I want to use Swift because it's awesome. I love Swift. It's the greatest thing ever created. I want to use it everywhere. Put it in the server. Put it in my app. Put it on my Mac app. Put it in the command line. Everywhere should be Swift. No more Objective-C. No. That's just, only dinosaurs use that stuff. That might be, your initial reaction. But maybe that's not the best argument on why to pick a certain technology. We just heard Roy talk about, don't try to treat things like a silver bullet. So maybe it's not the best argument as to why we want to use Swift for scripting. But it turns out that there are some really, really good logical arguments as to why Swift might be a good choice for scripting. Well, first off, if you're a Swift developer, you're going to have way less context switching if you're going to use Swift both for your app, but also for your scripts. That is important because it gives you a slower barrier for entry. It will make it easier for you to get started. And that is kind of good because it will usually lead to you creating more automation quicker. Because, I was always feeling that I could create automation like, maybe I'm doing this repetitive thing over and over again and maybe I should write a bash script for it. But I was always just hesitant because, maybe I don't want to do it right now, maybe tomorrow, maybe next time. But having a lower barrier for entry will just make it easier for you to dive in and use the tools that you're already familiar with. Speaking of tools, you have some really great powerful tools in Swift at your disposal. For example, core graphics for image manipulation and URL session for networking. And these are tools that you already know, that you've been using hundreds of times. So it'll be easy for you to dive in and start using them for things like resizing images or cutting them up or maybe tinting them or manipulating them in some other way. So that's another reason I really like Swift for scripting. But the most important one, and the one I am the most excited about, is the reason which is unique to using the same language for scripting as well as for applications development, which is that you can use code sharing. You can actually share code between your scripts and your app. And this might sound a little bit crazy, like why would you want to do that? But I want to dive in a little bit deeper here and show you an example of where this can be really useful. So in my spare time, I'm not only working on Swift developer tools and frameworks, I'm also doing game development, because why not? Games are fun, so why not make some? That's a lot of fun, right? So one problem I had getting started with game development was that I do a lot of programming. I'm pretty used to that. I've been doing it for a long time, but I have no idea how to do graphics at all. Like, I can't draw. It's impossible. I can barely draw a stick figure. Thankfully, I have some really nice friends who are really good at graphics. And what they do is that they create these nice little charming characters that we can then put in the game and create these animations. So my job as a programmer is to just simply take these animation configurations and model them in the app, here using this animation structure, where I simply point to a graphics file or a series of graphic files, specify the frame count and the duration, and then pass it on to the game engine for rendering. So in the beginning, when we started working on these games, I was doing these animation configs by hand. For every time the graphics guys would create some graphics, I would just go in and create one of these animation configs, and every time something would change, I would just update them. Fair enough. But then we kept iterating on the game, and it started scaling up, and we were adding more and more animation to the point where we currently have over 100 animations in this game that we're working on. So doing these animation configurations manually, that was super boring, super repetitive, and very error-prone, because it was very easy for me to miss something. And every time my graphics guys wanted to update something, well, they had to ask me to do it, which was, kind of blocking in a way. So, same thing as before, let's solve this with a script. So that's what I did. I basically created this simple script that instead of doing these animation configs manually, simply iterates over an array of all the different units that we have in the game. So we have stuff like swordsman and archer and knight, and for each one, we just iterate over it and we load a configuration file. Putting things like this in the file system was a big game changer for games. And that because then my graphics guys could actually go in and edit these things themselves. They could just change some parameters in a config file instead of having to go and modify the source code. But I want source code. I don't want to read these files dynamically in the app. That would slow things down. So then we use code generation to actually generate these native animation configurations right away from the script. And there are some great tools out there already for Swift for code generation, such as Sorcery and SwiftGen, etc. So this script, it did the job, and it definitely made things a lot easier, but it did have one big problem. And that was this array here in the top. This array constantly became outdated because it was hard-coded in the script. It was only configured for these types of characters in the game. So when we would change things like rename a character or add one or remove one, this script started breaking. And one thing you really don't want with your automation is for it to constantly break. You know, that would be kind of annoying. Then you have to go back and update it, and it's not so automatic anymore. So the problem really was that we had two sources of truth. It's, you know, classic problem for programming, right? The one source of truth was here in this script. The script had this idea of the world that it only had these types of units. But then in the game, we were actually using an enum for this. So we had this class that represents a unit, and we had this enum inside of it that represents different kinds of units. Again, the swordsman, archer, etc. So the game this was the source of truth we were using in terms of the game logic. We were just reading this enum here. So we could add stuff here without remembering to update the script. So here comes a cool thing where since we're using Swift both for scripting and for the application and game development, we can actually go ahead and simply import our game models package right in the script. That way, we can create an enum sequence based on that exact enum that we're using in the game, and then use the identifier for each case to load this configuration file. That way, the script is always up to date, it always works, and when things are added in the game, they automatically get added in the graphics animation as well. So this is a pretty cool thing, I think, where we can easily share code between our app and our scripts. So let's say you want to get more into Swift scripting. Maybe you've done some scripting in the past in different languages, or maybe you're starting out from scratch. Where do you start? How to get started with Swift scripting? Well, the easiest way to get started is just to create a simple script.swift file, which just simply runs your logic. You can do stuff like get an argument from the command line API, and then just print something. And then you can just run it by passing the path to your script to the Swift compiler, which you automatically have installed if you have Xcode installed, and that will just compile it and run it right away. The advantage of this approach is that things are really simple. You just have one file, you can edit it in any text editor you want, you can just run it from the command line, very, very easy. But there are some caveats, and first and foremost, you don't really have easy access to frameworks. And this is the one thing that I think sets Swift currently apart a bit from other scripting languages, where like Ruby and Python, etc., have had a long, long history of developing lots of gems and packages that you can easily use in your scripts. And things like this is starting to happening for Swift, but if you can't even use them inside of a script like this, it kind of becomes very hard. Another disadvantage for me, at least, I know some people, they're not huge fans of Xcode. I kind of like to use Xcode, at least for Swift development, and it's really hard to use Xcode when you just have a single file. Xcode expects to have an Xcode project file, so having just a single file doesn't really work. And this is where we can turn to a more powerful tool for the job, which is the Swift Package Manager. The Swift Package Manager comes with Swift, and you might know it from using things like loading your dependencies, but you can actually also use it for scripting, which is pretty cool. What you can do is you can create a Swift package using Swift package init and pass type executable. That will actually give you a command line tool, which you can kind of treat as a script. You then have this package.swift file where you can set up dependencies. So in this case, I'm using the files library from GitHub, and I can then use it in my scripts. So what this will give you is we will give you a main.swift file, and this file is where you're going to put your scripts. So in this case, I'm importing files, and then I'm iterating over all the files in the current folder and simply printing each one. Compiling and running is done by invoking Swift build, which basically builds a binary command line tool that you can then execute right from the command line. So you can go into the build folder, the debug subfolder, and then run the script from there. The advantage of this approach is that it becomes really powerful. It's also a lot faster because when Swift simply runs your script from the command line, it doesn't use any optimizations. But here you use optimizations, it's powerful, and it's fast. And you can use frameworks, which is really, really great. So it makes you a lot more productive in your scripting. However, by doing this, we've also added some complexity. And complexity might not be a problem when you're building an app or a proper big command line tool. But if you're just building some simple little script that you want to use to increase your productivity, it's kind of a problem because we've gone from just having one little file, one script file that we can just run from anywhere, and now all of a sudden we have a package file, we have a certain directory structure, we have lots of different things, and things have become a little bit more complex. So as I was getting into Swift scripting and I was learning about these different approaches and different ways of running scripts, I kind of thought to myself, wouldn't it be nice if we can still have the same power, the same ability to use frameworks and use packages, but without the complexity, and instead have a very simple approach like we did when we just had a single file. And this is what led me to create a tool actually for this that is called Marathon. And Marathon is an open source project that basically enables you to easily write, run, and install Swift scripts. What it does under the hood is really just to create Swift packages for your scripts. So you're still using the Swift package manager and all the power and flexibility that comes with it. You can take advantage of all the optimizations that Apple is doing, but you can just have a single script file instead of having to manage this entire structure of a project. So what I'd like to do now is to actually show you a demo of how you can use a Swift script and how to run it using Marathon. So after this morning, I'm a bit scared to do a demo, but hopefully wish me a bit luck. All right, so I'm gonna jump over here. Let's see, I'm gonna put this aside for a moment. So it doesn't stay there, yeah, great. All right, you can see my screen. And let's hide this stuff. No, not launch Spotify, not now. It would be nice to listen to some music while we're doing a scripting. I have a scripting playlist if you want it. I can share it with you later. All right, so we're here in the terminal, and I'm in a scripts folder. So I want to create a script now. So what kind of script are we going to build? Well, you guys probably love playgrounds. I really like playgrounds. I think it's a great way to learn new things in Swift. And it's a really great way to prototype things. So let's say you have a new library that you're either building or maybe you're trying it out and you want to have an easy access to a playground. Playgrounds, if you want to use them for something like trying out a library, you have to create the playground, convert it into a workspace, drag your framework in, start coding, so quite a lot of steps. This is something where we can actually script it. So let's write a script that generates a playground for us to use with one of our frameworks. So I'm going to start by creating a script using Marathon. So I'm going to run Marathon create, and we're going to call it play because we're going to just play around with some code here. And that's going to create a script at play.swift, and it's going to open up Xcode for me. So here, what Marathon has done under the hood is actually just to generate a Swift package. We can see here that I have some dependencies. Where do these dependencies come from? Well, if we run in a separate window, we have to make this a little bit bigger. If we run Marathon list, we can see that we have some packages that have been added to Marathon. And this is as simple to do as just running Marathon add and giving it a GitHub URL, and it's going to automatically fetch any open source library that you want to use. So we're going to jump back into Xcode here and take a look at main.swift, which is basically our script file. So I'm going to remove that, and let's make this full screen. So let's write this script here. So what are we going to do? Well, first, we're going to check in the current folder that we're in for an Xcode project. You might know that an Xcode project is just a folder. It's just a folder with a different extension. So we just need to find it. We're going to do that using files. So I'm just going to say import files here. And I'm going to start iterating through every subfolder in the current file system directory. So wherever this script will be run, we will just iterate through it. So that's going to be subfolders. So here in this iteration, I get access to the folder that I'm currently iterating on. And the first thing is to check, is this an Xcode project? And we do that just using if folder extension equals Xcode proj. So that's like how we identify a project. All right, so we found our project. What do we do now? Now we're going to use another framework, which is called Xgen. So we simply import that as well. What Xgen does is enables you to quickly generate playgrounds and workspaces. So we're just going to create a workspace using the workspace object. And we're going to give it a path. In this case, we're just going to call it play. So it's going to create a workspace in our current folder. So how do we add a playground? Well, we simply call workspace.addPlayground. And we have a playground. So that's simple. How do we add our project? We call workspace.addProject, and we give it the path. In this case, it's just folder.path. So that way, we've added now our Xcode project to our workspace. And finally, let's generate it. So we're going to call try workspace.generate. And that's going to generate this workspace in the current folder. All right, next, we want to open up this workspace. So how do we do that? Well, for that, we're going to use another library. So we see it's very easy here to just import your dependencies. And this one is called shellout. Shellout enables you to basically jump from a Swift script into the command line and run a native command. And that's pretty useful because even though Swift scripting is super nice, sometimes you need the power of the command line, like for Git, or in this case, for just opening a folder. So I'm going to shell out into open, and then just the path of the workspace. So it's going to be workspace.path. All right, so we've done that. Now we're done. We don't need to continue iterating because we already found our Xcode project. And for that, we're going to use the exit API and exit with code 0. That's basically telling our API user or script user that we exited without an error. All right, so our script is done. You know, super simple. We just close Xcode now. And we go over to this here. We're just going to resize this a little bit here. And now let's go ahead and run our script. So I'm going to jump somewhere now where I actually have a framework. So I'm going to jump into code/unbox, where I have unbox. And I'm simply going to now run this script using marathon run and give it the path, which is scripts/play.swift. And that's going to compile my script under the hood into a binary and then execute it for me as well. So we can see now something is happening. There we go. We have a playground. It has unbox. We can import unbox here. And we can now play around with unbox as much as we want. So I think that's pretty cool. That's just like a way of using Swift very, very quickly to create a script to now we can run play from anywhere. But we still have to invoke it using Marathon. And that can be a bit tedious to have to do that all the time. So let's actually install this script now instead so we can use it from anywhere from user local bin. So to do that, I'm simply going to run marathon install and give it the same path to my script, play.swift. It's going to compile it using release mode for maximum optimization for speed. It's then going to move it into user local bin. It's also going to ask me, because I already have something here, so it's going to ask me to confirm that I actually want to install it and overwrite this binary. In this case, I do. And it's going to install it for me. So what does that do? Well, now I can jump to another folder. Like in this case, I'm going to jump over to wrap. And I can just run play now because it's a normal command line tool. I can run it from anywhere. And run that, and boom, we have a playground. So now you can see you can become super productive in creating playgrounds and jumping in and trying new things out. So great example, I think, of using scripts for just avoiding these repetitive tasks. All right, so let's jump back to the slides. All right, so that was just an example of how you can use Swift script and Marathon. So what are some useful APIs when you're scripting? You're mostly using the same tools that you're used to. Using Foundation, you can use AppKit, Core Graphics, URL Session, anything that you want. But you can have some of these APIs here which are really useful for scripting tasks. Like, for example, parsing arguments using the command line API, or getting data synchronously, because a script just runs from top to bottom. So you might not want to introduce a lot of asynchronicity. You might just want to load things right away. If you do need to use asynchronicity, though, dispatch semaphores is a great way to just keep your script alive while you're performing different tasks and aggregate them. And then you can use the process API to create new processes and shell out into the command line. Printing is just done with print, like you're used to, and you can exit your app using the exit code with different codes. For example, if you failed, or if everything went the right way. So I think personally that creating scripts is a great way to create your own automation and your own tooling. So, you know, as Swift developers, we tend sometimes to maybe not spend so much time creating our own stuff, you know, creating our own automation and own tools, because we tend to rely a lot on Apple to do that kind of stuff. You know, we're kind of thinking that, you know, Apple is, you know, responsible for creating everything that we use, from Xcode to all the command line tools and everything. And this sometimes leads to us being a bit frustrated because, you know, we're waiting for Apple to, can you do this stuff? Come on, Apple. And, you know, I always say that there's this simple formula that you can use, which is almost always true. And it goes like this. You take 2 iOS developers and you give them some beer, and then you wait for about 10-15 minutes. What happens? Well, they're going to start complaining about Xcode because that's what we do, right? And that's, of course, healthy. It's good to, talk about a little bit about what you do and your environment and, complain together and have some fun. Of course, that's good. But let's not let that slow us down. Let's not only rely on Xcode for all of our developer needs. Let's not wait around for Apple to build the next thing that we need to do. Instead, I think it's great for us, now that we have Swift and Swift scripting, it's easier than ever to not wait around for Apple to build the tools that you want to use, and instead build them yourself, and build them together in open source communities. So that's it for me. If you want to keep in touch with me after the conference, I am at John Sundell on Twitter. I also write a weekly blog about Swift development on Medium, also at John Sundell, and all the tools that you saw here today, XGen, Marathon, Files, Shellout, etc. They're all available, free to use, MIT license on my GitHub profile. No creepy licenses at all. And what I just want to do now is end this with like a little, I guess, quote that I think sums up my thoughts around Swift scripting, which is that anything that a human has to do more than 5 times is better done by a script. Thank you very much.